Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razam Pereira. Russia and the other members of the Treaty on Open Skies held a video conference on Monday to discuss the framework's future following America's announcement in late May that it plans to withdraw from the agreement. The Treaty on Open Skies allows member states to conduct surveillance flights over one another's territories under certain controlled conditions in order to reduce the likelihood of a war by miscalculation. The US's withdrawal raised concern that the global security architecture will continue to collapse. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the road ahead for the Open Skies Treaty. Joining me on the program today are Vassily, Kashin, Senior Research Fellow, National Research University, Russia, Ashok Sajjanhar, former ambassador, and Patrick Buchan, Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, joining us from Washington, D.C. in the United States. All right, let me start the program with you, Ambassador. Let's first try and understand and put into perspective, what is this Treaty on Open Skies?
Frank, this Treaty on Open Skies is one of the pillars of global security. And this is basically to advance transparency. It is good to promote confidence-building measures, to promote predictability, to promote certainty. So as you mentioned, it is a treaty that allows unarmed monitoring air vehicles to go to each other's territory and to go over the military establishments and to inspect and to survey these establishments. It was started in 1992. That is when President George H.W. Bush was the president. And after ratification, it came into effect in 2002. It has 34 members. One of the members, 35th member, Kyrgyzstan, that has not ratified the treaty as yet. And as you mentioned, on the 21st of May this year, it was announced by America, by President Trump, that they are going to withdraw from this treaty because they said that the Russians are not abiding by the principles, by the objectives of this treaty, because they do not allow the aircraft of the United States and of the other members. Out of these 34 members, it is United States, it is Canada, it's a large number of NATO members and other EU countries also. Russia, Belarus, they are also members of this treaty. So the United States said that Russia does not allow its aircraft, let us say it prevents them flying over Kaliningrad, flying over Abkhazia, the borders with Georgia. So it has not been following the provisions of this treaty. So they are withdrawing. On 21st of May, they announced and they notified the Open Air Commission that they'll be withdrawing. Their 6 months of notice is required. Now, Russia has refuted all these allegations, and they say that it is basically a political decision that has been made by the United States. You would recall that last year in 2019, United States had also withdrawn from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And the critics have also remarked that with the INF Treaty and with the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was signed in 2015 with Iran, this would be the third arms control treaty which President Trump would have done away with. And this would have a very negative impact on security. The Europeans are, of course, worried because they say that this treaty is basically for their own protection. So meeting, as you mentioned, was held just 2 days ago on the 6th of this month, and discussions are to take place as to what is going to happen. And if United States withdraws, other members can, of course, continue with the treaty. So we'll have to see what happens.
Absolutely. Let me bring in the other panelists also into the picture. Now, let me go across to Vassily from Moscow now to get a picture or to get a perspective really in from Russia and what the Russians think really as far as this whole situation is concerned. So, Vassily, are the compliance concerns raised by the United States administration vis-a-vis Russia justified?
Well, there have been certain complaints from the Russian side about the abuse of certain treaty provisions by the other side, by US and some of the US allies as well. For example, the flights for over the Kaliningrad region were used just to circle this territory for many hours in a row. Because you can actually have a flight with very significant length, but the territory is tiny, and that was a significant disruption of the Russian military and even sometimes some civilian activities in the region. The flights over the border areas, which are unregulated and are regions of frozen military conflicts, would also be problematic. So there have been significant problems with that. On the other hand, we should remember that actually the treaty was about the military transparency. It was about the inability of one or another side to move forces covertly to conduct a military build-up or to prepare, for example, an attack under the guise of exercises that allowed you to inspect any kind of military activities which are undertaken by another side. To use it, to withdraw from this treaty just because you were forbidden to use it to monitor two problematic zones, which are very small, and taking into account the fact that there were abuses from the other side when they were just flying over Kaliningrad in circles for many hours and creating problems. I mean, it doesn't look like a valid reason for withdrawing from such a fundamental agreement.
Okay. Patrick, let me bring you to the picture now. This is about military transparency, like, Vassily Kashin just pointed out. But, there's a sense that President Trump wants to, move away from most of these multilateral organizations, like the ambassador himself pointed out, about the Iran nuclear deal and many other such things, the latest being the WHO as well. So, what's the ultimate game plan? Is it that the president doesn't like these organizations? Does he believe that these organizations are truly anti-America? Or what's it really?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. I think look, there is no question that this administration takes a very different view towards multilateral institutions, whether they be on trade, whether they be on arms control, whether they be on travel. What is important, though, I think that some people are missing in this debate, whether it be about Open Skies, INF, JCPOA, is that if the other side, that is the non-US side, is not in compliance with the agreements as stipulated in the treaty, then we risk the entire multilateral architecture built after World War II, which has served us all so well. If we allow one treaty to not be upheld and the regulations and laws that govern that treaty, then we risk the whole architecture becoming redundant. So I think one side of the argument could be, yes, the Trump administration takes a very dim view and the America First agenda. But in fact, those of us who do believe in the liberal rules-based order would argue that if we allow one treaty to not be upheld, then we risk, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And as the ambassador did point out, yes, we have seen the United States withdraw from three fundamental arms control treaties under this administration. But also, if we look back a little bit earlier in this century, and I know it sounds very strange to say in this century, but if we think back to the Bush administration pulling out of the ABM treaty, which is the so-called ballistic missile shield. So we have seen the United States over the last 20 years slowly walking back some of those obligations and the argument they do make is, one, it doesn't suit America's security interests, but two, the other side, if you will, is not upholding its obligations.
Right. So, Ambassador, I think that's a very valid point that Patrick is making, and I'd like to take that point forward with you. What's going to be the fate of the other treaties now going forward? If the idea and agenda is to get out of most of these treaties, why have these treaties at all?
No, that's right, but I think they have been able to bring peace and security and some measure of trust and credibility as far as the operations are concerned, and these countries have really been able to work together. As I mentioned, this treaty came into being in 2002, so it has not been all that long a time. It's just been about 18 years. And INF that came into being in 1987, and that also was given up last year. And the only other arms control treaty is New START, the New Strategic Arm Reduction Treaty, and that also is due to expire in February next year. And so far, we have not really seen anything happening either to extend it or otherwise. There seems to be, even within the United States itself, and of course amongst NATO and European countries, there seems to be quite a division, because the Democrats in the United States seem to be suggesting that this is something that has served the country well, served the world well, served Europe well. So we should continue with it. So, Mr. Biden, who is the Democratic nominee, he says that if he were to be elected on the first day that he comes back into office, he is going to sort of, bring this treaty back. And and all the, whether it's in the Senate, Armed Forces Committee, Foreign Relations Committee, Chuck Schumer, and all very many senior Democrat senators, they have been saying that it should continue. As far as Europe is concerned, whether it is France, Italy, even in the meeting that took place 2 days ago, there were more than 10 members out of the 34 members which expressed regret that the United States was withdrawing from this treaty. So as it appears, although the United States has said that if Russia were to resume compliance with the provisions of the treaty, they would be ready to come back to it and continue with it. But as it appears, this seems to be more of a political decision. So it is going to make the region and the world, I guess, if this treaty also were to go away, somewhat more unsafe than it would be with this treaty around with us.
Okay, all right. So one more opinion that is doing the rounds, that's going about, Dr. Kashin, is this, the fact that understandable this has been in place and this treaty has come into being only 18 years ago. But let's not forget, technology too has evolved tremendously over the last 18 years. So with modern drones and satellite technology, has the treaty outlived its utility? Because that is one point that is coming through as well.
Well, Open Skies Treaty is still very valuable. Of course, satellite technology has improved, but satellites are flying at predetermined trajectories, which are known to all sides, and that is allowing the other side to take certain measures to cover the military activities. Satellites have certain limitations depending on the weather. They cannot see below the clouds. So the ability to send at any time a reconnaissance plane into any location which is looking suspicious for you is very valuable. It's giving you an opportunity to actually check what is going on. For example, is there concentration of troops which is looking offensive, etc. I should say that during the Cold War, that we used to have a number of dangerous situations when exercises of conventional forces, ground forces, air forces looked for the other side as a preparation for an attack. And at that time, such a capability would greatly improve our security, and it's very valuable now, especially now when the relations between Russia and the United States are so bad. Well, drones cannot. Drones are just the same thing. The planes which are just unmanned and they cannot fly into other sides' airspace without permission. So the planes, the reconnaissance planes which were used under the treaty, was a very valuable instrument. And of course, at some point, the American side was very much concerned about the ability of Russia to use these planes to get some information about the U.S. military activities, which couldn't be accessed by any other means. And that was also a matter which was discussed during the negotiations and during the discussions of the issue in the American media.
Right. All right. So, Patrick, since we are here, let me ask you a basic academic question. So because since this treaty has been in place, or since the negotiations for this treaty has been going on for several decades now as well, disputes about compliance have been a constant feature as far as this treaty is concerned. So, that having been said, do you believe that the treaty has served its purpose?
I think, Frank, it unquestionably served its purpose for the time in which it was written. One of the things, and I think I've mentioned this on your program before, when foreign policy reality, that being when history takes the course it does, and the architecture which served the time which it was written diverge, then we have a problem. When this treaty was negotiated, we were coming out of the Cold War. Relations between the United States and Russia, and indeed the then nascent Warsaw Bloc, were open for to bring some sunshine into that relationship. But there's a very critical point to each of these treaties that the United States has withdrawn from, and that is they do not include China. The United States' primary strategic focus is now towards China, no longer to Russia. So for the United States, when it has treaty obligations, firstly under a previous world order where the Soviet Union and Russia were the paramount threat to the United States, and yet China is not included, the United States feels that it is hamstrung by its strategic priorities. Therefore, I think some of this must also be seen that the United States is perhaps sending a message by withdrawing from these treaties with the Russians, that the message to the Chinese is we will not be hamstrung by treaties. Now, however, potentially that does open up a path for the United States and China to now start negotiating separate arms control and confidence building measures between them. And I think that is a critical point that is often missed in this. And that was a primary reason the United States withdrew from INF, that the Chinese were not bound by this. So yes, those of us who do believe that these confidence building measures, these arms control measures are critical, when we have China, the world's #2 military and economic power, not bound by this, it certainly hamstrings the United States, but more importantly, it allows China a free kick, if you will, to get away with what it does get away with.
All right, Ambassador, your thoughts on what Patrick is suggesting really as far as US and China situation is concerned, and also you spoke about politics in your earlier comments. So is this also yet another platform really for President Trump to deflect what is happening back home? Because let's not forget the elections are around the corner, and topics like China and Russia get a lot of traction on the ground in the United States.
No, you're very right, Frank. And what has been mentioned by Patrick, I think there is considerable significance. There's considerable weight in what he has said, that China is not a part of this treaty. It was not a part of the INF treaty. And so it would be advisable to get China also. And China, in terms of its military power and military innovation and military strength, it has grown over the years. But then my question would be that INF, after the United States withdrew from that, and it said that we would like to negotiate a new treaty, a fresh treaty, with China in it. China has refused to come in. And also, as far as this treaty is concerned, the Open Skies Treaty, there also China is not willing to enter into any sort of an engagement, any sort of a negotiation. So I don't know whether that is the right way to go about it, to withdraw from it and then demand that China should also become a party to this agreement. Couldn't there have been another way of as far as this whole treaty is concerned, asking China, the whole group having a talk, a negotiation with China to bring it under the fold, under the umbrella of this treaty of INF also. So I agree, I recognize the salience of what Patrick has mentioned, but I'm not very certain whether this is the right way to go about it. And the last question that you mentioned about politics, I think in terms of politics, this has the potential to further polarize as far as the domestic constituencies are concerned, as far as the domestic electorate is concerned. I don't know whether Mr. Trump will be able to get any significant advantage as far as his constituency is concerned, because here you are dealing with Russia, and what there is a consensus as far as the US, whether it is business or it is politics, it is the Congress, it is the common people, it is the academia, it is that China today is the systemic rival. China is the strategic adversary as far as the United States is concerned. So China has been made to be, one of the elements on which President Trump is basing his election campaign. Not so much Russia, not so much this treaty, so far at least, meaning it is China, it is WHO, it is the COVID pandemic, it is that crisis that has emerged. I don't know whether this will have so much of traction as far as the people, as far as the constituencies and citizenry of the United States is concerned.
All right, Vassily, Kashin, what is the fate of the treaty now going forward?
Well, I think that the New START treaty is likely to fall apart, and I think it's almost impossible to expect it to be extended because we have too little time. It can only be extended if it's completely unchanged and unamended. Any attempts to amend it are unproductive. But at the same time, we have to understand that we are at the early point of very deep transformation. And that deep transformation is caused by the evolution of Chinese military capabilities and especially Chinese nuclear forces. China is moving into a new stage, new league. This is a country which just this April accepted 2 new nuclear ballistic missile submarines into its navy. They are simultaneously producing 3 types of intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are working on bomber. They are the 3rd country in the world which is building a ballistic missile early warning system. So it's an emerging 3rd nuclear great power. And that is a completely new reality. We never lived in the world where there were 3 great nuclear powers. We used to live in the world where nuclear capabilities of everyone else except from Russia and United States could be considered as negligible compared to the great nuclear powers. So there certainly will be need to develop a new approach for the strategic stability problem within several years. And that will be a very challenging task because the experience we have from the Cold War era would be largely useless for us. That's a big problem. So even if we could extend this treaty, it would just, live for several years and then it would be impossible to observe it.
Absolutely. All right. So yeah. So let's look at some of the other signatories. Also, is clearly Russia and the United States are at loggerheads, Patrick. But let's not forget there are 32 other signatories as well. So what's their stand and what would they like to happen? Because they would clearly be concerned about Russia and the United States not being a part of this treaty.
With you know, with I guess with the greatest respect to all of the other nations concerned, I think I agree with Vassily. If the United States and Russia are no longer signatories, I think the point to the treaty becomes pointless. I think it's wonderful that we have these large multilateral treaties, but let's be frank, this treaty is about Russia and the United States and the confidence building measures between those two. The other parties, or those signatories, are largely bystanders. I mean, that's just the reality of how great power politics works.
That's the reality and the plain truth.
That is the reality. That's the plain truth. Often we don't like to speak of the plain truth when it comes to great powers and multilateralism, but that's reality. I think I'd like to just, if I may, point to what the ambassador was referring to. I think sometimes those of us in the foreign policy and the national security world, and particularly here in Washington in the Beltway, we overlook the impact that this will have electorally. I'm pretty confident to say that the vast majority of the American people are not aware of the Open Skies Treaty, and I'm not sure that, you know, folks who are in Peoria, Illinois, as they're worried tonight about COVID, paying the mortgage and the rent, the grocery bills and the electricity bills, are going to swing a single vote based on the United States withdrawing from the Open Skies Treaty. So I think it does allow governments in Washington on foreign policy to have a more free hand without being concerned about the electoral blowback on this.
Okay. I've got 2 minutes left on the program, so very quick closing comments from all my panelists with the best way forward, starting first with the ambassador.
Well, you know, both the other panelists have mentioned that it is all between the United States and Russia, but, you know, at this meeting that took place 2 days ago, there were a large number of European participants who expressed a deep regret that this was happening. And if I'm not mistaken, you know, the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, Mr. Rybakov, he also mentioned that he did not see anyone wanting to go back out of this treaty along with the United States. So Russia has expressed its satisfaction and happiness that this treaty will continue even without the United States. You know, and we've had examples, Frank, like you had the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, TPP. So the United States withdrew, but the other 11 members have continued with it. Right. So maybe this would also could continue, but there are challenges like, you know, in terms of sharing by Europe of intelligence that they get with the United States. And I think those are issues that will need to be discussed. But whenever a treaty continues, there is always a platform for dialogue. And I think that is important. That is it.
Absolutely. Keep the dialogue going is what the ambassador is suggesting. Vassily, Kashin.
Yes, there will be interest in maintaining the treaty for some time. On the other hand, the key problem of European participants of the treaty sharing information with the Americans would emerge from time to time. The treaty still could have certain limited use for Russia without American participation because it would allow us to monitor NATO activities on the European theater. So we will need to constantly weight the balance of costs and benefits. Much will depend on behavior of the closest US allies in Europe, such as Poland.
Right.
What will be their behavior? The treaty will certainly become very fragile, so we will try to stay in it, but there is likelihood that everything falls apart at certain moment.
Okay, all right. And Patrick, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Frank, I'd like to allude to something that I think the ambassador mentioned before. We have the New START Treaty coming up in February 2021. We have seen a concerning pathway over the last 2 or 3 years of withdrawal from these arms control treaties, largely legacies of the Cold War and the post-Cold War era. The United States is on a path, in my view, to not re-signing up to New START without specifically, unless the Chinese are included. And Vassily made an excellent point. We must prepare ourselves for a world where we now see a growth path for China joining that very elite club of major nuclear powers. I think China is certainly on that path. The key question becomes, one, how do the two existing members of that club accommodate a third member? How do we ensure trilateral global strategic nuclear stability? And three, how do the world's diplomats and strategic policy folks come up with an architecture which ensures China is included, is bound by the treaties, and abides by those?
Right, absolutely. All right then, with that, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.